The end of the world didn't come with a roar, but with a whisper of dust on the wind. There were no motherships blotting out the sun, no guttural declarations of war broadcast across terrified airwaves. It began with a subtle change in the light, a faint, prismatic quality to the sunsets that poets wrote about, unaware they were eulogizing a dying planet. Then came the glass lung. It started in the industrial heartlands, in cities choked with their own progress, where the air was already a toxic cocktail. Doctors thought it was a new form of silicosis, a mutation born of pollution. But the victims weren't miners or factory workers. They were children, office clerks, librarians. Their lungs didn't scar. They crystallized, filling slowly with microscopic, luminous filaments until each breath became a sharp, herring agony. By the time they drowned in their own glittering blood, their chests were heavy as stone. The world panicked, but it panicked in the wrong direction. Nations blamed each other, accusing rivals of airborne chemical attacks. Borders slammed shut, economies fractured, and the slow, grinding machinery of civilization seized up, all while the real enemy went unnoticed, working its patient, geological magic beneath their feet. Dr. Eris Thorne watched the chaos from the granite heart of the Canadian Shield, a man exiled by his own prescience. Years ago, the geological community had branded him a heretic for his papers on crystalline life forms and theoretical planetary metabolism. They had laughed him out of lecture halls when he proposed that a world itself could be a slow-moving organism, and that another, stranger life could infect it like a disease. He had warned them, his voice raw with conviction, that the universe was not limited to the frantic, carbon-based scramble for life that defined Earth. He spoke of beings that measured their existence in eon, that did not conquer but assimilated, converting rock and water and flesh into their own slow, crystalline consciousness. They called him a fantasist. Now, the world was becoming his fantasy, and it was a nightmare. His wife and daughter had been in Chicago when the first great spire had bloomed. It hadn't erupted, it had simply grown, rising from the heart of Millennium Park overnight, a colossal, translucent shard that pulsed with a soft, internal light. The official story was a bizarre, unprecedented geological event. Eris knew better. He knew it was an organ, a primary node in a network that was consuming his world from the inside out. He had begged them to leave, but they, like everyone else, had believed in governments and evacuation plans, in the comforting illusion of control. The city's communication went dark a week later. Chicago was now part of the Shimmer, a vast crystalline exclusion zone where the air hummed with an alien frequency and the very ground had been transmuted into something sharp, beautiful, and utterly lethal. Eris was no soldier. His hands were stained with rock dust and graphite, not blood. His weapons were seismographs, mass spectrometers, and the bitter, vindicated knowledge that had cost him everything. For 2 years, he had been a ghost, living in his remote, self-sufficient research outpost, monitoring the death of his planet through the shuddering of the bedrock. He charted the growth of the Shimmer, the slow, methodical advance of what he called the silicate plague. He learned to read its rhythms, the deep, resonant pulses that radiated from the great spires, the nexuses. It wasn't communication in a way humans understood it. It was a planetary hum, a seismic song that coordinated the conversion. The silicates weren't just on Earth, they were becoming Earth. And recently, the tempo of that song had changed. It was accelerating, the slow consumption giving way to an aggressive, ravenous growth. Humanity wasn't just being crowded out, it was being actively digested. The time for observation was over. The ghost had to walk again. Leaving the sanctuary of his outpost was like stepping onto the surface of a different planet. The air, even hundreds of miles from the nearest shimmer zone, had a sharp, metallic tang. The soil crunched under his boots with a glassy sound, and strange, coral-like crystal growths sprouted from the trunks of dead trees, glittering in the weak sunlight. He followed the old highways, long stretches of asphalt fractured and buckled by the tectonic pressures of the conversion. He was heading for the Cobalt Belt, a region once rich with mines and quarries. If humanity had any chance, it lay not in soldiers with guns, it, but in people who understood how to break rock, how to harness resonance, how to make the earth itself scream. Guns were useless against a geological process. You couldn't shoot a tectonic plate, but you could shatter it. He found the survivors huddled in the skeletal remains of a mining town called Threshold. They were a hard, grim-faced community, their faces layered with the fine, gray dust that was the precursor to the shimmer. They were led by a woman named Eva Rostova, a former mine foreman whose authority was etched into the stern lines of her face. Her voice was like grinding rock, and her eyes held the flat, pragmatic weariness of someone who had spent a lifetime making calculated risks deep beneath the earth. She listened to Eris's frantic explanations with a dangerous stillness, her hand never straying far from the heavyweight industrial wrench tucked into her belt. The other survivors, blasting technicians, drill operators, a haggard communications engineer, watched him with a mixture of suspicion and desperate hope. "You're telling us," Eva said, her voice low and disbelieving, "that the world is being eaten, and your plan is to make a lot of noise." "Not noise," Eris countered, his voice trembling with an intensity that bordered on madness. He spread his seismic maps across a dusty table, charts filled with concentric circles and complex wave patterns. A signal, a counter-resonance. The spires, the nexuses, they are tuning forks. They vibrate at a specific frequency to liquefy and transmute the bedrock, coordinating the growth. But like any crystal, they have a resonant fracture point. If we can generate a powerful enough and focused seismic event, a percussive wave tuned to the right frequency, we won't just knock it down. We'll shatter it. We'll disrupt the network. Sever the connection. And he pointed a trembling finger to a spot on the map 30 miles away, a place where the contour lines converged violently. There, that's the nearest nexus. It grew out of the old Northridge quarry. It's feeding on a massive granite deposit, and it's the reason the dust is so bad here. It's why the glass lung is accelerating. We have to destroy it. For days, they argued. Eva saw a suicide mission, a fool's errand proposed by a man who had spent too long alone with his grief and his theories. But her own people were dying. Their dust filters were failing, their food supplies dwindling. The shimmer was advancing, as crystalline fingers reaching for their sanctuary. Every night, they could hear the low, pervasive hum emanating from the quarry, a sound that vibrated not in their ears, but deep in their bones, a constant reminder of the alien presence that was unmaking their world. It was the hum that finally convinced her. She had heard that same low groan in the deep mines, the sound of rock under unbearable stress, the prelude to a catastrophic collapse. Eris wasn't just a madman, he understood the enemy because he understood the earth it was devouring. The plan they devised was one of desperate, audacious engineering. It was a heist against the planet itself. Their target was the Northridge Nexus, a monstrous crystalline cathedral that soared 1,000 feet into the perpetually gray sky, its facets refracting the dim light into 1,000 unsettling rainbows. Getting close was a nightmare. The ground around it was a treacherous landscape of razor-sharp crystal formations and chasms that split open without warning. The air was thick with silicate dust, forcing them to wear jury-rigged rebreathers that rasped with every painful breath. They moved like phantoms through this alien garden, not soldiers on a battlefield, but miners entering the belly of a hostile beast. Their weapons were not rifles, but sonic drills, shape charges, and spools of detonating cord. Eris guided them, his gaze fixed on a modified seismograph, its needle twitching erratically. "It's singing to the granite," he whispered into his radio, his voice distorted by the rebreather. "It's breaking it down, molecule by molecule. We're not just on the creature, we're in it." Eva and her team worked with the grim, focused efficiency of professionals. They weren't fighting for humanity or abstract ideals. They were fighting for one more sunrise, one more clean breath. They repelled into fissures, planting charges at key stress points that Eris had identified, nodes where the seismic energy of the Nexus was most concentrated. They worked against the clock, the very rock around them groaning as it slowly transmuted, crystalline veins spreading like frost across the granite walls. Twice, the ground beneath them gave way, plunging a man in a cache of explosives into a newly formed chasm, his scream swallowed by the abyss. There was no time to mourn. Finally, they were in position. Eva stood at the mouth of the main quarry pit, the detonator clutched in her gloved hand, looking back at Eris. His face, illuminated by the ghostly glow of the Nexus, was a mask of sheer terror and ecstatic hope. This was the culmination of his life's work, the moment his insane theory would either save them or entomb them. "This is on you, Doctor." Eva's voice crackled over the radio. "If this doesn't work—" "It will," Eris breathed, his eyes fixed on the spire. "It has to." Eva depressed the plunger for a heart-stopping second. Nothing happened. The world was silent save for the ever-present hum. Then, a deep, guttural tremor shook the ground, a vibration that felt fundamentally different from the alien frequency. It was a human sound, a discordant, violent note injected into the planetary song. The charges detonated in a precise, staggered sequence, not in a chaotic explosion, but in a focused pulse, sending a shockwave of pure sonic force directly into the base of the Nexus. The great spire shuddered. A low, harmonic moan escaped it, a sound of sublime and terrible pain. Cracks of brilliant white light raced up its crystalline surface, spreading like lightning through a frozen sky. For a moment, it shone with blinding intensity, and then, with a sound that was not an explosion, but the shattering of a universe-sized glass bell, the Northridge Nexus disintegrated. It did not fall, it simply ceased to be, imploding into a billion motes of fading light. The oppressive hum that had dominated their lives vanished, replaced by a profound, ringing silence. Below them, the ground stabilized. The terrifying process of conversion halted. They had done it. They had cut the cord. Standing there, covered in dust and sweat, they stared into the empty space where the monster had been. It was a victory, small and fleeting, but real. Then Eris looked down at his seismograph. The needle, which had fallen silent, began to twitch again. It started as a flicker, then grew into a frantic, rhythmic dance. Across the globe, from 1,000 other nexuses, a new signal was rising. It was no longer the patient, methodical hum of consumption. It was a focused, enraged, and unified scream. They had poked the hive, and now the entire hive knew their name. The silence that followed the Nexus's fall was more profound than any sound, a vacuum where a planetary heartbeat had been. For a few precious seconds, the survivors of Threshold breathed air that was just air, felt a stillness in the rock beneath their boots that was just the planet's solid, familiar mass. It was a peace so absolute it was terrifying. Then came the response. It began not as a sound, but as a pressure in their skulls, a low-frequency thrum that bypassed their ears entirely. Eris watched, his face a canvas of dawning horror, as the needle on his seismograph began to vibrate violently, not with the chaotic spikes of an earthquake, but with the clean, terrifying sine wave of a broadcast signal. It was a pulse, coordinated and precise, coming from every direction at once. The silicate plague had stopped whispering its patient song of conversion and had begun to scream. The ground beneath them didn't just tremble, it resonated, a deep, angry thrum that vibrated up through the soles of their feet and into their teeth. Out on the crystalline plains where the Nexus had stood, a ghostly luminescence began to rise from the ground, the shattered motes of the spire reawakening, coalescing. "What is that? What's happening?" Eva's voice, usually as steady as bedrock, was sharp with alarm. She was looking past Eris, her eyes fixed on the horizon, where the distant shimmer zones that ring their valley had begun to glow with an aggressive, feverish light. "They know we're here," Eris said, his voice barely a whisper. He couldn't tear his eyes from the seismograph. I thought severing the node would create chaos, confusion in their network. But it's not chaos. It's a response. It's a command." He looked at her, his academic detachment finally shattering, revealing the raw terror beneath. "We didn't blind it. We just told it exactly where to find us." The proof came less than an hour later. A scouting party sent to retrieve the remaining explosives from an outlying cache failed to report back. When Eva sent a second, smaller team to investigate, they returned in a frantic, stumbling retreat, their faces pale with a new kind of fear. They spoke of the ground itself coming alive. They described how the razor-sharp crystal formations had begun to move, to reform, extruding thin, scythe-like limbs and pulling themselves from the earth. They called them splinters, jagged, dog-sized constructs of translucent crystal that moved with an insectile speed, their movements accompanied by a high-pitched chittering, like scraping glass. They were hunters driven by the planetary signal, and they were swarming the valley. Threshold was no longer a sanctuary. It was a baited trap. The small victory at the North Ridge Quarry had been the clang of a dinner bell, and they were the meal. Panic, cold and sharp, began to grip the community. Their refuge, won through sheer stubbornness, was becoming their tomb. They were miners and engineers, not soldiers. They knew how to break rock, not fight an army of it. It was Eva who silenced the rising tide of fear with a single, sharp command that cut through the noise. Her pragmatism was a shield against despair. "We move. Now," she declared, her gaze sweeping over her terrified people. "Pack the rigs. Grab the water purifiers and the core samples. Anything else is dead weight." Then she turned to Eris, her expression hard and unforgiving. "You got us into this, Doctor. Now you get us out. Where do we go?" Eris, surrounded by his maps and the frantic scrawls of his new calculations, felt the crushing weight of 200 lives settle onto his shoulders. Flight was a temporary solution, and the scream was global. There was nowhere on the planet to hide. Their only hope was to turn their weapon, their knowledge of resonance, and from a single bullet into a cannon. "We can't just run," he said, his voice gaining a desperate strength. "We have to fight back on their terms, on a planetary scale. The charges we used were a firecracker to shatter the whole network. We need to strike the Earth's mantle itself, generate a resonant frequency so powerful it propagates through the crust and shatters every nexus simultaneously. We need an amplifier." He stabbed a finger at a large-scale geological map, tapping a remote location deep in the arid badlands of what was once Utah. Here, the Diaphone Array. It was a Cold War-era project, officially for deep Earth tomography, unofficially for communicating with submarines using ultra-low-frequency seismic waves. It was designed to send a signal through the planet. If we can get there, if we can modify its broadcast core and tune it to the fracture frequency, we can give the whole planet a new heartbeat. We can make the Earth scream back. It was a plan born of equal parts genius and madness, a sliver of hope so thin it was almost invisible. But it was the only one they had. The exodus from Threshold was a grim, hurried affair. A convoy of massive, 18-wheel mining haulers and jury-rigged transport trucks rumbled out of the valley, their tires crunching over the increasingly crystalline ground. They were a nomadic tribe, a tiny island of warmth and noise in a world that was growing cold, silent, and sharp. Eris rode in the lead truck with Eva, his seismograph wired to the truck's battery, its needle a constant, terrifying metronome counting out the rhythm of their enemy. The journey south was a descent into a wholly alien world. The familiar landscapes of pine forests and rolling hills gave way to petrified forests of glittering crystal, their branches reaching for the sky like skeletal glass hands. Rivers ran sluggishly, choked with crystalline silt, their banks encrusted with geometric, coral-like growths. And everywhere they saw the splinters. They skittered at the edges of the convoy, their multifaceted bodies refracting the dim light, watching, waiting for a truck to break down, for a straggler to fall behind. They were the scavengers of this new world, and humanity was the carrion. Their first major test came at the crossing of the Serpent River, where a massive steel bridge spanned a deep canyon. The bridge was still intact, a relic of the old world, but the canyon walls around it were infested. The scream of the silicate network was stronger here, and it had given birth to something new, something far more terrifying than the splinters. As the lead hauler cautiously made its way onto the bridge, a colossal shape pulled itself from the crystalline lattice on the far canyon wall. It was a sentinel, a bipedal golem of semi-translucent quartz nearly 50 feet tall. It moved with a slow, grinding inevitability, its steps shaking the very foundations of the bridge. It didn't seem to see them in a visual sense. It was drawn to the vibration of their engines, the discordant noise of their existence in its harmonized world. "Reverse, reverse now!" Eva bellowed into the radio. But it was too late. The sentinel raised a massive, club-like arm and brought it down on the bridge's support structure. Steel screamed and buckled, and the far end of the span sagged violently. They were trapped. The convoy ground to a halt, a line of metal boxes caught on a dying steel serpent. The sentinel took another ponderous step, the bridge groaning in protest. Panic erupted over the comms. "We have to fight it," a voice shouted. "Use the blasting charges." "No," Ares yelled, his mind racing. "A chaotic explosion will just bring the whole bridge down. We have to use its own nature against it. Eva, the sonic drills. What's their maximum frequency?" Eva, her face grim, relayed the information. Ares made a series of frantic calculations, his hands flying across a notepad. "It's a single construct, a coherent crystalline structure. It has a resonant core, just like the Nexus, only smaller. We can't shatter it completely, but we can destabilize it. We need to focus the output of 3 drills on the center of its torso. Tune them to this exact frequency. He scribbled a number and shoved it at her. It won't be a weapon, it will be a tuning fork. We just need to give it a note it can't handle. It was a desperate gamble. 3 teams of miners, their faces set with grim determination, scrambled from their trucks, lugging the heavy sonic drills. They set up a tripod formation, taking aim at the slowly advancing giant. The sentinel seemed to ignore them, its focus solely on the largest source of vibration, the convoy's engines. Now, Ava commanded. 3 beams of focused, high-frequency sound, invisible and silent to human ears, converged on the sentinel's chest. For a moment, nothing happened. The crystalline giant continued its advance, raising its arm for another strike. Then, a low hum began to emanate from its core, a discordant note in the planetary song. The hum grew in pitch and volume, becoming a piercing shriek. Cracks began to appear in its translucent body, not from impact, but from internal stress. Its movements became erratic, its form shuddering as it fought the sympathetic vibration tearing it apart from the inside. With a final, explosive shriek of shattering crystal, the sentinel's torso imploded, its limbs collapsing into a cascade of sharp, glittering fragments that rained down into the canyon below. They had survived, but the bridge was critically damaged. It took them 12 precious hours to winch the trucks across the buckled remains, one by one, all while the chittering of the splinters echoed from the canyon walls, a promise of the horrors still to come. As they pressed on, deeper into the Badlands, a new and more insidious threat emerged. The silicate plague wasn't just creating monsters, it was learning. The crystalline growths along their path began to change, forming intricate, lattice-like structures that mimicked the shapes of trees, of buildings, even of people. These were echoes, psychic traps that resonated with the memories of those who passed by. Drivers would slam on their brakes, swearing they saw a child standing in the road, only for the mirage to dissolve into a cloud of shimmering dust. They began to hear things on the wind whispers in the voices of lost loved ones, snippets of old songs, the laughter of ghosts. The psychological toll was immense. The journey was breaking them, not just their bodies, but their minds. Eris found himself haunted by visions of his wife and daughter, not as they were, but as crystalline statues with hollow, glittering eyes, beckoning him into the shimmer. And he saw the doubt in the eyes of the survivors. They followed him, but they no longer looked at him as a savior. They looked at him as the architect of their exodus, the Moses of a dying people, leading them to a promised land that might be nothing but a grave. Finally, after weeks of relentless travel and harrowing losses, they crested a dusty mesa and saw it. The diaphone array. It was a collection of squat, concrete bunkers and, dominating the landscape, a circular field a mile in diameter, studded with thousands of metal pylons that plunged deep into the Earth's crust. It was a monument to human arrogance, a machine built to command the very planet, but their relief curdled into dread. The array was not silent. At the center of the pylon field, where the main broadcast core was housed, a new nexus was growing. It was younger and smaller than the one they had destroyed, but it was pulsing with a furious energy, its crystalline structure weaving itself into the very fabric of the array. It was feeding on the immense geothermal and electrical power of the installation, growing stronger with every passing moment. The one place on Earth that could save them had become the heart of a new infection. Their weapon was in the hands of the enemy, and it was being turned against them, pointed not outward at the stars, but downward, into the very core of the world. The sight of the nascent nexus entwined with the diaphone array was a physical blow, a kick to the gut of their dwindling hope. It was a strategic masterstroke of an enemy that possessed no strategy, only a terrible geological instinct. The silicates hadn't just found the array, they had been drawn to it, a nexus of power attracting a planetary parasite. The central bunker, which housed the primary control room and the broadcast amplifier, was almost entirely encased in the crystalline growth, its thick concrete walls veined with pulsing, translucent lattices. The pylon field itself was a death trap, the ground between the metal transmitters seeded with thousands of twitching, half-formed splinters, a writhing carpet of living glass. The planetary scream was deafening here, a relentless psychic pressure that made their teeth ache and their thoughts feel sluggish and foreign. This wasn't a fortress to be conquered, it was a tumor to be excised, and they were the surgeons, armed with wrenches and dwindling hope. "We can't get in there," Eva stated, her voice flat, devoid of its usual iron. She was looking through a pair of powerful binoculars, her knuckles white. "The main access tunnel is sealed. The growth is covering everything. We'd have to cut our way through 100 feet of that stuff, and the whole field is crawling." Eris, however, was staring at the nexus with a feverish intensity, his mind a whirlwind of terror and intellectual fascination. "It's not just covering it," he breathed, pointing to the glowing veins that snaked from the nexus into the surrounding machinery. "It's interfacing with it. It's learning. It's trying to use the array for its own purposes, to amplify its own signal. But it's crude, inefficient. It's like a child trying to play a grand piano by banging its fists on the keys. The array was built with fail-safes, redundancies, and manual overrides. If we can get to the secondary control hub, deep underground, we might be able to sever its connection and hijack the system." He pulled out a weathered schematic of the facility, a relic from his research days. He traced a finger along a thin, dotted line. "Here, a geothermal maintenance conduit. It runs 500 feet below the main complex and surfaces 2 miles south of here, at venting Station Gamma. It's a long shot. It could be collapsed, flooded, but it's the only way in that isn't solid crystal." The plan was suicidal, and everyone knew it. They would have to split their forces. Eva would lead the main group, creating a loud, dramatic diversion at the northern perimeter, drawing the attention of the Splinters and the Sentinel-class Guardians they could now see patrolling the edge of the pylon field. Meanwhile, a small, specialized team, led by Eris, would infiltrate the facility through the maintenance conduit and fight their way to the secondary control hub. They were a skeleton crew Eris. With his knowledge of the system, a wiry communications engineer named Kenji, whose deft fingers could coax life from dead electronics, and 2 of Eva's most trusted miners, broad-shouldered twins named Alec and Ivan, whose silent competence with heavy tools and explosives was more comforting than any army. As Eva's convoy of haulers roared to life, their engines modified to produce maximum seismic and acoustic disturbance, the real assault began. The diversion was terrifyingly effective. The ground shook as Eva's team detonated a series of shape charges along the northern ridge, triggering a massive rock slide. The Splinters, drawn by the chaotic vibrations, swarmed towards the noise, a chittering tide of living glass. 2 sentinels, larger and more defined than the one they'd encountered at the bridge, rose from the pylon field and began a slow, ponderous march towards the commotion. It was the opening they needed. Under the cover of the cacophony, Eris and his small team slipped away, their electric utility cart a silent ghost against the backdrop of geological warfare. The entrance to Venting Station Gamma was a crumbling concrete blockhouse half buried in the shifting dust. The heavy steel door had been warped by seismic stress, and it took the combined strength of Alec and Ivan, straining against a massive crowbar to wrench it open with a groan of tortured metal. The air that billowed out was hot, stagnant, and thick with the smell of sulfur and ozone. They descended into the darkness, their headlamps cutting feeble swaths through the gloom. The conduit was a tight, claustrophobic tunnel, barely tall enough to stand in, lined with thick pipes coated in decades of grime. Their progress was slow and agonizing. Sections of the tunnel had collapsed, forcing them to crawl through narrow and debris-choked spaces. In one section, a geothermal pipe had ruptured, filling the air with scalding steam that fogged their goggles and made every breath feel like inhaling fire. But the physical obstacles were nothing compared to the psychological assault. As they drew closer to the main complex, the psychic scream of the Nexus intensified, no longer a dull pressure, but a sharp, invasive force. It probed at their minds, plucking at their deepest fears. Eris was tormented by the crystalline image of his daughter, her voice a perfect, heartbreaking echo in his head, begging him to stop, to join them, to embrace the quiet perfection of the shimmer. Kenji froze, his hands trembling, as he heard the frantic, distorted transmissions of the world's final broadcasts, a chorus of forgotten news anchors announcing the fall of cities long since turned to glass. Even the stoic twins were affected, their faces pale and beaded with sweat, their eyes darting into the shadows as if expecting an ambush from their own past. "It's in our heads," Alec grunted, his voice tight with strain as he helped his brother clear a rockfall. "We have to block it out." "You can't," Eris said, his own voice shaky. "It's not a broadcast. It's resonance. It's vibrating the water in our own cells. It's using us as antennae. The only way to stop it is to get to the source." After what felt like an eternity, they reached the sublevels of the array. The clean, sterile environment of the schematic had been transformed into a grotesque fusion of human technology and alien biology. Crystalline growth sprouted from the wall, their internal light casting eerie, shifting shadows. The air hummed with a palpable energy, and thin, filament-like tendrils of crystal snaked across the floor, tapping into power conduits and data ports, drawing nourishment from the facility's lifeblood. The Nexus above them wasn't just a parasite, it was a hacker, learning the station's layout, its power grid's its neural network. They fought their way through corridors patrolled by a new kind of horror. These weren't the mindless splinters of the surface. Here, in the heart of the machine, the silicates had begun to merge with the station's automated security systems. They encountered maintenance drones, their articulated arms replaced with scythes of razor-sharp obsidian, their optical sensors glowing with the same internal light as the Nexus. They moved with a terrifying synthesis of machine precision and organic, predatory hunger. Ivan was the first to fall. One of the drones dropped from a ceiling vent, his crystal blade slicing through his rebreather and deep into his shoulder. Alec roared with fury, mabtying his pneumatic bolt gun into the construct, shattering its crystalline chassis. But the damage was done. They had to leave Ivan's body behind, a grim sacrifice to their desperate mission. Finally, bleeding, exhausted, and on the verge of mental collapse, they reached the reinforced doors of the secondary control hub. The doors were sealed, and the electronic lock was dead, but the crystalline tendrils were already at work, trying to breach the seals slowly, patiently dissolving the metal. Alec, his face a grim mask of grief and rage, set a shaped charge. "Get back," was all he said. The resulting explosion blew the doors inward with a deafening boom. They stumbled into the room, a cavern of dormant electronics, a silent testament to a forgotten age. A thick layer of dust covered every console, but beneath it, the technology was pristine. This deep, the silicate growth had not yet penetrated. Kenji, his hands now steady with a desperate sense of purpose, threw himself at the main console. He worked with a feverish speed, blowing dust from ports, rerouting power from emergency batteries, his fingers flying across the keyboards as he bypassed decades of digital decay. "I'm in," he announced, his voice tight with triumph. "The core systems are offline, but the amplifier's geothermal power source is still active. The Nexus is drawing from it, but it hasn't gained full control. I can sever its connection." On the main view screen, a schematic of the array flickered to life. A pulsing red icon showed the Nexus's parasitic connection. A few keystrokes, a cascade of green text, and the red icon vanished. A collective sigh of relief filled the room, but their work was only half done. "Now, for our part," Eris said, his voice trembling as he handed Kenji a series of complex equations. "We need to reroute all available power to the central pylon. We're going to use the Nexus itself as the focal point of our broadcast. We're going to turn their own amplifier into a weapon against them. Kenji, can you tune the broadcast frequency to this exact resonance?" As Kenji's fingers danced across the keys, a new icon appeared on the screen, a pulsing blue sine wave. The human heartbeat they were about to inject into the planetary scream. The power levels on the console began to climb, the room humming with a rising tide of energy. "It's working," Kenji whispered in awe. "Power is approaching broadcast threshold." Suddenly, the entire facility shuddered violently. A new alarm blared from the console, a sound no one in the room had ever heard. On the schematic, dozens of new red icons were appearing, swarming their location. "What is that?" Alec demanded, aiming his weapon at the ruined doorway. "They know what we're doing," Eris said, his eyes wide. "They've adapted. They're not just sending splinters and drones anymore." He pointed a shaking finger at the screen, at the designation for the new threat. "They're sending wardens, biomechanical constructs from the core of the Nexus itself. They're coming to stop us." The shuddering intensified, and the sound of tearing metal and shattering rock echoed down the corridor, growing closer with every second. On the console, the power bar was a sliver away from full. They were out of time. The sound that heralded the warden's arrival was not the chittering of glass or the whine of servos. It was the groan of the facility tearing itself apart. The reinforced concrete walls of the corridor outside the control hub buckled inward, and the metal door frame, already mangled from their entry, was ripped from its moorings as if by an invisible hand. The first warden that squeezed its way into the control room was a perversion of life and geology, a nightmare synthesis of the organic and the crystalline. It was roughly humanoid in shape but stood 12 feet tall, its body a mosaic of interlocking, smoky quartz plates that shifted and ground against each other as it moved. It had no face, only a smooth, featureless head that pulsed with a faint, internal crimson light, crystalline tendrils, thicker and more menacing than the ones they'd seen before, whipped from its back, crackling with raw, stolen energy drawn from the facility's power conduits. It was the planet's immune system, a white blood cell of living rock, and they were the infection it had come to purge. Alec met its advance with a roar of pure, undiluted fury, his bolt gun firing in a relentless staccato, the hardened steel projectiles, which could punch through a half-inch of plate steel, ricocheted off the warden's crystalline hide with showers of sparks, leaving only superficial scratches. The warden didn't even flinch. It swatted Alec aside with a casual, backhanded blow that sent him flying across the room, his body crashing into a bank of dormant servers with a sickening crunch. The warden's attention then shifted to the two remaining humans, its faceless head tilting with an unnerving, analytical curiosity. "Power at 98%, Kenji yelled, his eyes glued to the console, his hands a blur of motion as he initiated the final broadcast sequence. "I need 10 more seconds." "You don't have them," Eris screamed back. He grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from the wall, the only weapon within his reach, and hurled it at the warden. The metal canister bounced harmlessly off its chest. The warden took another step forward, its tread heavy enough to crack the tiled floor. The tendrils on his back arched forward, their tips glowing with a deadly, incandescent energy. This was it. The end of their desperate, insane gambit. Then, from the ruined corridor, came a sound of defiance. Alec, his arm bent at an unnatural angle and blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, was staggering to his feet. In his good hand, he held the last of their shaped charges, a small, fist-sized block of high-grade explosive. His face was a mask of bloody, grim resolve. "For Ivan," he snarled. He didn't throw the charge. With a final, guttural scream, he ran, not away, but directly at the warden. He lunged forward, slamming the charge against the creature's chest and, in the same motion, depressing the manual detonator. The explosion was brutally contained within the confines of the control room. It wasn't a fireball, but a concussive, shattering blast of pure force. The warden was lifted from its feet, the quartz plates on its torso blowing outward in a spray of razor-sharp shrapnel. Kenji and Eris were thrown to the floor, the air ripped from their lungs, their ears ringing with a deafening, high-pitched whine. When the dust and smoke cleared, there was a gaping, smoking hole in the warden's chest. The crimson light within its head flickered and died. Alec was gone, vaporized in the blast, his sacrifice having bought them the precious seconds they needed. "Now, Kenji," Eris roared, scrambling back to his feet. On the console, the power bar hit 100%. With a final keystroke, Kenji initiated the broadcast. "Firing," he whispered, a prayer and a curse in one. There was no sound in the control room, but they felt it in the very marrow of their bones. Deep beneath them, the diaphone array's central amplifier discharged a colossal amount of focused energy, not as chaotic noise, but as a single, pure, resonant frequency, Eris's frequency. The human counter-signal. They watched on the main schematic as a brilliant blue wave of energy pulsed outward from their location, propagating through the planet's crust at the speed of sound. It was the first beat of a new heart, a human-made rhythm designed to shatter the alien song. For a terrifying moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then, the entire facility began to groan, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated in perfect harmony with their broadcast. Outside the ruined doorway, a second warden that had been advancing down the corridor suddenly froze. A high-pitched, harmonic whine began to emanate from its crystalline body. Cracks of pure, white light spiderwebbed across its surface. With a silent, implosive flash, it disintegrated into a cloud of inert, glittering dust. It was working. The counter-resonance was tearing the silicate constructs apart from the inside out. On the global seismic map, They saw the effect ripple across the planet. One by one, the red icons that marked the great nexuses began to flicker. They saw the nexus in the heart of the Amazon shimmer, the one that had consumed the great cities of Europe, the colossal spire that had risen from the Pacific Ocean. All of them began to resonate with the human frequencies. It was a planetary exorcism, a single, sustained note of defiance that was shattering the crystalline network. The planetary scream, the psychic pressure that had been their constant tormentor, began to falter, its unified voice breaking into 1,000 discordant, dying shrieks. But the planet, the true Earth, was screaming back in its own way. Their broadcast was not a gentle pulse. It was a planetary-scale act of violence. Injecting that much energy into the mantle was triggering every fault line, every dormant volcano, every point of tectonic stress on the globe. The seismic map lit up with a new set of warnings: catastrophic earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis. They were killing the parasite, but they were also breaking their world. Eris watched the cascade of disaster warnings with a numb, hollow feeling. He had saved humanity from the fire, only to deliver it to the flood. Their work was not yet over. The broadcast had to be sustained, the frequency fine-tuned as the silicates attempted to adapt, but they were no longer alone. Through the chaos, a new signal cut through the static on the comms panel. It was Eva's voice, strained and barely audible over a roar of background noise. "Eris, what in God's name did you do? The whole world is coming apart. The splinters, they're shattering. The sentinels just fell apart like glass statues. We're alive, but the ground is..." Her transmission was cut short by a violent tremor that shook the control hub, sending a shower of dust and concrete from the ceiling. "Eva, we're here. We have control of the array," Eris yelled into the microphone. "The counter-resonance is working, but the geological blowback is extensive. We have to shut it down before the planet tears itself apart." "We can't," Kenji said, his face pale. He pointed to the console, where a new, horrifying diagnostic was flashing. The broadcast initiated a feedback loop with the amplifier's geothermal core. The Nexus may be gone, but the array is now drawing power directly from a magma conduit. It's redlining. I can't shut it down from here. The system is locked in a runaway cycle. It's going to overload. Overload. "What does that mean?" Eris asked. A cold dread seeping into his veins. Kenji's expression was grim. "It means that in approximately 1 hour, the entire diaphone array is going to detonate with the force of a supervolcano. We didn't just give the planet a new heartbeat. We planted a bomb in it." The irony was savage. They had won. They had shattered the silicate plague, broken its hold on their world. But their victory was to be a footnote in the planet's final, violent act. They had traded a slow, crystalline death for a swift, fiery one. Through the static, Eva's voice returned, desperate and pleading. "Eris, talk to me." "What is happening down there?" Eris took a deep breath, the air thick with the dust of his Pyrrhic victory. He looked at Kenji, at the schematic showing the blue wave of life and the red warning of death, inextricably linked. He thought of Alec and Ivan, of the countless others who had fallen. Their sacrifices had to mean something more than a slightly delayed apocalypse. There had to be a way. There was always a way. "Ava," he said, his voice calm and steady for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "We've stopped them. The silicates are broken, but the array is going to blow. We have to find a way to contain the blast, to vent the pressure. Get your people. Get the haulers. Get everyone as far away from here as you can. Kenji and I, we're going to stay. There's one last thing we can try." He was looking at a schematic of the geothermal core, at a series of massive primary coolant tunnels designed to vent excess heat into the atmosphere. They were a fail-safe, never meant to handle this level of energy, but they were their only chance. It was a one-way trip to the heart of the machine, a desperate attempt to perform open-heart surgery on a bomb. The final hour of the world was a study in contrasts. On the surface, a fragile, terrifying peace was descending. Under the gray, dust-choked sky, Eva Rostova's convoy raced away from the diaphone array, the ground still shuddering with the death throes of the silicate network and the birth pangs of a new, man-made cataclysm. Through their truck windows, the survivors watched in stunned silence as the crystalline forests and razor-sharp plains dissolved, the alien structures collapsing into vast fields of inert, glittering sand. The planetary scream was gone, replaced by the deep, visceral rumble of an angry Earth. They were free, but they were fleeing the very weapon that had freed them. Eva's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, her radio a constant, open channel of static-laced hope, listening for a voice she knew would likely never come again. Deep underground, in the humming, overheated heart of the array, there was no peace. The secondary control hub had become the epicenter of a ticking time bomb. The air was scorching hot, the metal consoles almost too hot to touch. Alarms blared in a chaotic, overlapping chorus of doom. Eris and Kenji worked with a silent, focused intensity, their faces slick with sweat, their movements economical and precise. They had abandoned any hope of their own survival. Their world had shrunk to this single, desperate task, mitigating the apocalypse they had unleashed. Their goal was the geothermal core's primary regulator, located in a shielded chamber 3 levels below them, at the very bottom of the facility. According to the schematics, a manual override could divert the energy overload from the amplifier into the planet's deep Earth mantle, turning a planet-shattering surface explosion into a contained, subterranean blast. It would still be a cataclysmic seismic event, but it might prevent the Earth from being rendered a molten, uninhabitable cinder. The journey downward was a descent into hell. The elevators were dead, so they took the emergency stairwells, the metal steps glowing a dull, cherry red. The facility's automated fire suppression systems had kicked in, flooding the corridors with thick, choking foam and jets of scalding steam. They were no longer fighting crystalline monsters, but the raw, untamed power of the Earth itself, channeled and amplified by their own creation. Kenji, his engineer's mind still working despite the suffocating heat and the certainty of their fate, managed to seal a series of blast doors behind them, a futile but profoundly human gesture to contain the inevitable. They found the regulator chamber behind a massive, circular vault door, the kind designed to withstand a direct nuclear strike. The heat radiating from it was immense. "The locking mechanism is fused," Kenji gasped, his breath ragged. "We'll never get it open." But Eris was looking at the schematics on a hardened data tablet, his mind making one last, desperate leap of logic. "We don't go through it," he said, pointing to a network of smaller pipes on the diagram. "We go around. This is a coolant conduit. It feeds directly into the regulator housing. It will be hot, but it should be hollow." It was their final, agonizing trial. Armed with a plasma cutter from an emergency locker, they sliced through the wall of the conduit. The moment the seal broke, a wave of superheated air blasted them backward. They crawled into the pipe, a space no wider than a man's shoulders. the metal so hot it seared through their protective suits. They moved inch by agonizing inch, crawling through the very guts of the doomsday machine, propelled only by the knowledge that the fate of the world rested on their scorched hands. They emerged from the conduit directly into the regulator chamber. It was a cavernous space, dominated by a colossal, spherical core that pulsed with a blinding, white-hot energy. The air shimmered with heat, and the sound was a physical presence, a deafening, soul-shaking roar of pure power. In the center of the room, a single control pedestal rose from the floor, housing the manual override, a large, simple lever, encased in a protective cage. "That's it," Eris yelled over the roar. "The failsafe. If we can pull that lever, it should divert the energy flow." But as they stumbled forward, the chamber's final defense activated. A series of metallic plates slid down from the ceiling, forming an impenetrable barrier around the pedestal. A new display flickered to life on the wall, its message stark and brutal. "Manual override locked. Catastrophic core failure imminent. All systems irreversible." They stared at the message, the full weight of their failure crashing down upon them. They had come so far, sacrificed so much, only to be defeated by a final, automated protocol. Kenji sank to his knees, his face a mask of utter despair. But Eris refused to yield. His eyes darted around the chamber, his scientist's brain processing the impossible, searching for a variable he had missed. He saw the massive coolant pipes feeding into the core, the energy conduits pulsing with unimaginable power, the reinforced walls designed to contain a meltdown. And then he saw it. A flaw. A single, desperate, insane possibility. "The resonance," he whispered, the idea taking shape in his mind. "Kenji, the plasma cutter. Its power cell? What is its energy frequency?" Kenji, startled from his despair, rattled off the technical specifications. Eris's eyes lit up with a terrible, brilliant fire. "It's not a perfect match, but it's close," he said, his voice rising with a manic energy. "The silicates reacted to a specific resonant frequency. What if this technology, the core itself, is built on the same principles of harmonic stability? What if we can use the cutter not to cut the barrier, but to tune it, to find its resonant fracture point, just like we did with the Nexus?" It was the theory of a madman, a last-ditch fusion of physics and faith. With Kenji guiding his hand, shouting adjustments over the deafening roar, Eris activated the plasma cutter. He didn't press the blade to the barrier. Instead, he held it inches away, adjusting the power output, changing the frequency of the plasma stream. The air began to hum with a new, high-pitched note, a discordant harmony against the roar of the core. He moved the cutter slowly along the surface of the barrier, searching, listening, feeling for a vibration, a sympathetic response. For agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The heat was becoming unbearable, their suits beginning to melt. Then, he found it. A single spot on the barrier began to vibrate, a low hum that grew into a piercing shriek. A hairline crack of brilliant light appeared on the metal plate. "That's it! Hold it there!" Kenji screamed. With a final, desperate surge of will, Eris poured all his remaining strength into holding the cutter steady. The crack spiderwebbed across the barrier, and with a sound like a shattering bell, the entire plate disintegrated into shimmering, metallic dust. The path to the lever was clear. Eris stumbled forward, his body screaming in protest, his vision blurring from the heat. He reached the pedestal, wrapped his scorched gloves around the lever, and with the last ounce of his strength, he pulled. A deep, shuddering groan echoed through the chamber, a sound of immense machinery shifting deep within the planet's crust. The blinding light from the core began to dim, its furious energy being diverted downward into the deep, forgiving dark of the mantle. On the wall, the warning display flickered and changed. Energy reroute in progress. Core stabilization active. They had done it. They had saved the world. Eris collapsed against the pedestal, his strength finally gone. He looked at Kenji, who gave him a weak, weary smile. They had won. They would die here, cooked alive in the residual heat of their victory. But they had won. As his consciousness began to fade, a final thought, clear and serene, drifted through Eris's mind. He saw his wife and daughter, not as crystalline monsters, but as they were, smiling in the warm sun of a world he had just preserved. He had lost his own world to save theirs. It was a worthy trade. On the surface, Eva's convoy had stopped, miles away on a high mesa. They watched as the violent, earth-shattering tremors from the array subsided, replaced by a single, deep, prolonged rumble, like the sound of a mountain settling into a new sleep. The imminent explosion had passed. There was no fireball, no mushroom cloud, only a profound, echoing silence. In that silence, every survivor knew, with a certainty that was both heartbreaking and triumphant, that the men they had left behind had succeeded. The world they inherited was a broken one. The geological blowback had reshaped continents, altered coastlines, and awakened ancient volcanoes. The sky was a permanent veil of ash that would take a generation to clear. Humanity was a scattered, traumatized remnant, reduced to a few 100,000 souls. But they were alive. They were free. They were the children of a new, violent Earth. An Earth that had been pushed to the brink and had survived. They were the Ashborn, the survivors of a war fought not against flesh and blood, but against the very rock beneath their feet. They would rebuild, not with the arrogance of the old world, but with the hard-won humility of a species that had looked into the abyss and had found, in the heart of its own people, the will to pull itself back. They would tell the story of Dr. Eris Thorne, the heretic who saved the world, and of the miners from Threshold who taught him how to make the earth scream. Their victory was not the end of the story, but the fierce, defiant, and hopeful first line of a new one.